Hi guys, today we're going to be doing an experiment called Density for Daredevils. Before we start, we need to learn about density. Density is officially mass divided by volume. That probably didn't help you much, did it? By mass, we mean how much of something there is, and volume is how much space it occupies. I'm going to show you some examples that might help make that a little clearer. Here I have two little containers that have the same volume because they're the same size. So they've got the same amount of space inside of them. One is full of sand, and you'll notice there's not a lot of air in around the sand. So it has a pretty high density. There's a lot of molecules in that space. The leaves, even though it's filled to the same height as the sand is, there's a lot of air between the leaves. So the leaves have a lower density because there's less mass occupying the same amount of space. Now, let me show you another example. Okay, now we have here a pebble and a cotton ball. Now, if we'll notice, they have very different volumes. They take up a great deal different amount of space. The pebble is small and the cotton ball is big. So they have different volumes, but we're kind of curious how much they have inside. Now, it's hard to know that just by looking at them. We would have to do very complicated experiments, but in order to do it, we can also use a scale will kind of help us. This is my homemade scale. And so you'll notice that if I put the pebble in my scale, it's no longer level, it's way back there. And if I put my cotton ball that has a much higher volume over here, it didn't do anything. Well, let's keep adding some cotton balls. There's a sec 2, 3, ooh, we got a little movement, 4, a little bit more, 5, and with 5 cotton balls, we are almost level. Let's see what happens with the 6th. Oh, we're pretty close to level now. Cotton balls might be a little heavier. So notice that they have very different volumes. That pebble is occupying a tiny bit of space. The cotton balls are filling up a lot of space. So they have a much higher volume. This has a lower volume. But we're going to take this weight difference to decide that this probably has a much higher mass. So the pebble has a higher mass than the cotton ball does because the same amount of volume or different volumes to make the same weights. So now that you've seen that if we compare two things with the same volume, we can figure out if they are more dense or less dense by looking at the amount of space left available in that volume. And if we looked at two things that have different volumes, but the same mass, we can tell that one is denser than the other. We are ready to do a neat experiment about density. To do this experiment, you need to prepare a little bit in advance. You're going to need 3 cups, something to stir with, some little chunks of potato cut to about the same size. If you don't have a fresh potato, you could use a tater tot you cut into 4s. Or you could even, if you have hash browns, grab a little shred of hash brown to try it with. Any potatoes will work. We just want to keep the pieces small. So each cup has 1/4 cup of water in it. One is labeled fresh water, one is labeled salt water, and one is labeled sugar water. Right now, they don't have anything in them except water. But here with the salt water, I have 1 tablespoon of salt, I have 1 tablespoon of sugar, and another tablespoon of sugar, and you're going to need something to stir with. So if you'll get all of those things ready, we'll be ready to start the lab. Okay, we are ready to go. So remember we talked about density, about whether the stuff that occupies the same amount of space, whether there's more molecules within that space. So we're going to be comparing potatoes to water. So what do you think is going to happen if we drop a piece of potato into the cup of water? Do you think a potato is denser, has more stuff per the same amount of space than water does? Let's find out. If you look, our potatoes sank because potatoes are denser than water. But let's try out some stuff that can make the water denser. So remember, we have our tablespoon of salt. Let's pour our tablespoon of salt into the cup labeled salt water. And then we want to stir and mix that in. So get it all stirred in. Now, do you think this salt is going to make the water denser? If you do, you're right, because we're adding stuff that the salt is going to kind of sneak into any spaces between the water molecules. So now there's less space between them. So the thing is, the water will be denser. If you've ever been to the beach, you might realize how much easier it is to float at the beach than it is in a regular swimming pool, because the ocean has salt in it. So now that we've mixed that salt in, let's grab another little piece of potato. And what do you think is going to happen if we drop this piece of potato into that salt water? Let's try it out. Yeah. Look, our potato is floating because the salt water is denser than a potato. Even if you dropped a whole potato in, if you drop a whole potato in fresh water, it's going to sink. If you mix in enough salt into a big thing of water, a whole potato is going to float. But now we have some sugar. Do you think sugar is more dense or less dense than salt? Let's find out. Take one of your things of sugar and pour it into the cup labeled sugar water, then stir and mix that in. So when we drop our potato in, we have to figure out, do you think the potato is more or less dense than the sugar water? And do we think that sugar water is going to be more or less dense than the salt water? A lot of things to think about. Okay, my sugar is pretty well mixed in there. Got another little piece of potato here. So, what do you think is going to happen? And then drop your potato in. You notice it still sank, but it did sink a little slower. So just for fun, take that other thing of sugar and drop it in the water. And then stir that in. And notice what happens with your potato. I'm kind of beating up my potato a little bit, but it's still happening. So I bet if I stop stirring, look, now the potato is floating because we put enough sugar in that now that sugar water is denser than the potato, so the potato floats. So because we had to put in twice as much sugar to make that happen, we know that salt was denser than sugar. By adding that sugar, we made it denser than a potato. Now you could try this experiment with all sorts of things around your house. See which ones, if they sink in water, that happens if you put them in the salt water. What happens in the sugar water? If they still sink in the salt, how much more salt would you have to add to make them float, to make that water dense enough? Experiment with things around your house and have a good time.